Hi, everyone. Welcome to this case study webinar presentation with Casper Creek Natural Cemetery. Andra and Steve are joining us this evening. My name is Jody Buller, and I am Conservation Burial Alliance board member. I'm acting secretary, so I'm the one who gets the emails. And I will go ahead and send this recording to everyone who is registered, and please feel free to share it with people in your organization, whatever that might be. The Conservation Burial Alliance is not a certifying body. We are a resource and support organization and started as a peer support group. Those of us, maybe there were 10 of us at the time who were doing this amazing, beautiful, strange thing and wanting to help support other people who were feeling called to do the same. And I'm going to ask that everyone remain muted through this presentation, and I will be following along in the chat. If you have questions, that's a great place to put them. Just add them into the chat and we'll circle back around to them at the end of the presentation. I want to say thank you to all of you for your hearts and energies and interest in this work. It's not simple or easy, and it's pretty valuable. So we first met Andra through some of the Conservation Burial Alliance operators and startup forums, and got to meet Steve at the Land Trust Alliance rally in Portland last fall and hear a little bit of the story from the Joe Daviess perspective. And I'm so excited that they get to share this with you tonight. So I'll let them introduce themselves further, but thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jody. It is my great pleasure to introduce Steve Barg, who is the director of the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation. And when we were first asked by the Conservation Burial Alliance to put together this presentation and be able to share a little bit about the journey that we went through to be able to provide conservation burial through the Midwest, it came down to that meeting that Jody mentioned at the LTA rally. So I'm going to let Steve take the case from here, but it's primarily for what does it look like for a land trust to decide to embark on this kind of journey, and how does it benefit them as a land trust, as a 501c3, and what it took to get to where we are today.
Thanks, Andra. We're going to walk you through a case study that started back in 2015 or 2016 with some deep thinking and some serendipity that went into getting us to where we are today. But I'm going to start with our mission, which is to preserve and steward land and water for the lasting well-being of all people and wildlife. And we do that through 3 program offerings. We do land preservation. We buy land, we put conservation easements on land. We currently own and operate, we own a little over 2,000 acres of land, and we operate about 13 preserves that are open to the public, about a half dozen more that are not open to the public. So that's our land preservation work. We're in Northwest Illinois. Joe Daviess County is in the very northwest corner of Illinois, so that's our home. And we primarily work in Joe Daviess, Carroll, Stevenson counties, Northwest Illinois, and which is also importantly in the driftless, the unglaciated upper Mississippi River Valley area known as the driftless. So that's our home. That's where we're talking to you from. Our other program offerings are stewardship and education and outreach. We're going to be focusing on stewardship, but before we go there, just a little bit about who we are in terms of people. So this is the opening of one of our preserves, Gateway Preserve near Galena. So we're a member-based organization. We get a lot of support from the community. And we think of ourselves as a community conservation organization dealing with these three programmatic areas. We'll shift to the next slide, which starts to get into the reasons we've done this work. And actually, Andra, if you could go back to the last slide, I want to stay there for just a second. That's possible or not. There we go. So why did we do this? Why did we start a conservation burial business? Two main reasons. One very pragmatic and one more, I would say, strictly mission related. The first strictly mission related is we really wanted to, part of our work is to develop deep relationships between people and place. We do that by bringing people onto these preserves that we have. We do that through active stewardship and volunteer work. We do that through educational programming. So developing deep relationships between land, place, and people is a big part of our work. The second reason we did this is much more pragmatic, and that has to do with supporting our stewardship program, caring for the land. As our land grew, our stewardship program grew, and we really didn't not have the capacity to care for the lands in the way that we wanted to, so we needed to look for new revenue sources. So we can page through onto kind of where we started in 2007 with Christie. So this was, what is it? It'd be 17 years ago, 16 years ago. We had 161 acres of land, a lot less land than we have now. We had one person caring for that, Christie. She had one chainsaw. She had a walk-behind DR mower. She used her personal vehicle. And we had a little small part-time group of volunteers. That was our stewardship program. Next slide. This is Christie at work, and this is the TR mower. It looks like a guy trying to figure out, sell it at an antique auction or something. So in 2013, we had to really, it was kind of our oh crap moment. We went from 800 acres, we went from 161 acres to 800 acres. And we still had that small resource trying to take care of 800 acres of land, a single person, under-resourced with equipment, and we really needed to think differently. So we started looking at models, a variety of ways to raise some earned income rather than just charitable income. As a 501c3 organization, most of our revenue comes from charitable gifts, from foundations, individuals, and some from businesses. So here's the 4 ways we were rethinking an earned income strategy, again, to support our growing stewardship program. We looked at creating for-profit businesses that supported our nonprofit mission. We started to use the land to generate income through hunting leases, farming leases, conservation reserve payments, residential leases, and also exploring some other ideas that were a little further out and more difficult to reach. You can see carbon credits and community solar projects. We also started building stewardship endowments, long-term stewardship plan. We developed a policy that any new acquisitions, we, the staff, had to bring to our board an endowment plan. How were we going to raise money to put in an endowment, to earn investment income, to care for that property in perpetuity? So we had to start thinking about endowments. And then we needed to grow our capacity for stewardship. I'm not going to talk much about this, but suffice to say, we created another business that is essentially a fee for service for stewardship of land, mainly private lands and partner lands. I want to go back and answer a question that somebody put in the chat. How did we buy or purchase our first 161 acres? Some of our first quote unquote acquisitions were donations of land, which again comes with a permanent liability of perpetually caring for that. So when people donate land, we have to think really hard and long. Do we have the resources? Are we going to say yes to this gift? And do we have the resources, or can we go out and find the resources for perpetual care of that land? It's a permanent liability in some ways. And then most of our purchases since those donations have been through grants, and mostly grants from two entities in Illinois that gave money statewide to nonprofit conservancies like us for land acquisition. And I think last count, we submitted successful grants for nearly $10 million in acquisition funds from those two granting entities. Okay, I hope that answered the question in the chat. Earned income strategy, just wanted you to see where we're going to zoom ahead here. Through these strategies, for-profit enterprises, land leases, hunting, CRP, farm leases, some residential leases, and endowments, we're now generating an earned income, $329,000 as of last year. That means that's $329,000 I can put primarily to our stewardship program, and it's $329,000 I don't have to go to my donors to ask them to write continuously bigger and bigger and bigger checks every year. So this is getting at a sustainable aspect of our stewardship funding. How can we, as a non-taxing body, a nonprofit, find ways to generate income year over year over year over year that is not just people writing bigger charitable checks? Next slide. So the first business partnership we tried, and it actually ran for about 6 years. It ended during COVID, was we partnered with a brewery to sell beer. We entered into a memorandum of understanding with the brewery. They liked what we were doing. The owners of the brewery really liked that we were preserving land in the community, restoring it, and opening it to the public. And so the owners of Galena Brewery said, yeah, let's create a beer specifically around a character, in this case, Major Daviess, who kind of looks like, I don't know, name the pioneer, who he might look like, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, not sure. But nonetheless, this was the character. We created life-size characters of him where you could go out and do selfies on one of our preserves. They gave us all of the proceeds, 100% of the proceeds, minus the cost of the materials, not minus the cost of the labor to actually create the brew. It was a summer ale, and it ran from Memorial Day to Labor Day. and it generated about $6,000 annually, which was nice. We learned a lot in this, but it ultimately, we said it's bigger than a bake sale, but not enough to get where we needed to go permanently. Ultimately, the brewery was sold during COVID, and we have not established a new partnership with the brewery. We're now looking to establish a partnership with a local distillery. So we'll see where that goes in the coming years. The for-profit venture number 2 was Casper Creek Natural Cemetery. The idea was to offer a new conservation service to our members. We talked about that. Deepening connections with families who are here, who live here, or live in the region by burying their loved ones into the land, and that land being restored to natural areas, in this case, a prairie. We wanted to use the money to restore 18 acres that were at the time in a hayfield. And most of Casper Bluff around where the burial ground was already restored to prairie and savanna. So we wanted to restore the area where the cemetery was to prairie. Our goal is to make $80,000 annually to support our stewardship of all the other lands we have in the county, help offset those costs. And again, year 1, $46,000 in revenue. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into what it took to do this, how this idea came about. It really came partly from a member of ours who, while on one of our winter programs called Bonfires on the Bluff, we set out luminarias in midwinter, and they get to walk and experience nature at night. This beautiful preserve, big bonfires in the distance. One of our members thought, wouldn't it be interesting to create a natural burial ground? She had been researching it, and it was from this event and some conversations she had with friends at this event that idea was brought to the Conservation Foundation. For about a year, it sat in and amongst, I'm going to say, a dozen other businesses that we were vetting. So we looked at a campground, we looked at a zip line, we looked at creating organic farm, we looked at opening up a used bookstore in the town, which is full of tourists near us. We looked at a dozen different businesses, and we vetted each one, and the conservation burial business made the cut each time until it was down to 2. And we really then needed to invest dollars and a lot of due diligence into one. And our board formed a committee going to really look into this particular business, a conservation or natural burial business. We're very lucky to have one of our board members as an attorney and a business entrepreneur himself, and he led the committee through these various bullet points and processes. And they're not in any particular order, but you'll see this is literally pulled from our server in our office. All of the different folders in the pre-planning, you can see at the title there, CCNC planning pre-March 2020. Again, this started in Vain in 2016. And for 3 years, a committee met, I would say maybe monthly, maybe every other month, I can't remember. And we looked at all of these different aspects of creating a business, thinking about what it would take to do this. We asked our board initially for $15,000 to do, for example, an actual market research study. We hired a market research consultant and looked at actually phoned and emailed I don't know, several hundred people in our region, 5-county region, and asked them their thoughts about conservation burials. Is it something they would be interested in? Is it something they already know about? And we learned a lot from that study. Most importantly, we learned, for example, that about 6% nationally, according to surveys nationally at the time, this is back in, I'm going to say 2017 or 2018, about 6% of people surveyed nationally would choose a natural burial. From our market research, that number locally was about 10%. So that gave us some real local market analysis of, are the people in this area close to the national average, under the national average, or over the national average? From that, we started running based on death rates. How many people could we expect would be interested in at least learning more about conservation burial based on these surveys? We had to go through a zoning process and a special use permit to operate a cemetery on our property. That was through our county government. We had to go, because we wanted to be a conservation burial business, we had to enter into a conservation easement with a sister organization, a land trust, a few counties over that we knew very well. We had to do a feasibility study, a business plan, set up a pro forma over 3 years. What could we anticipate revenues and expenses would look like over 3 years? We had to go and borrow a couple of $100,000 to build out the cemetery. So we had to bring this business plan to our local bank. I could spend an hour going through this with you and more. Suffice to say, each of these folders has anywhere between 1 and 100 documents in it. And add up all those folders, you've got hundreds and hundreds of documents, really just documenting the research we did and tracking that over a 3-year period so we could make sure we were bringing a good case to our board that this was a viable business that was going to generate the income that we wanted. One other just sort of metrics that helps you understand, we have a board of directors. That board of directors meets every other month. In the 10 years, 11 years I've been part of this, directing this organization, served as its executive director, we've had 4 special meetings in 10 years. 3 of those 4 special meetings were about the cemetery. So there was a lot of scrutiny, a lot of skepticism, a lot of learning that we had to bring to our board because ultimately they're the decision makers for going a couple $100,000 in debt on a business venture that we have a good sense is going to make us the money that we need to operate our stewardship program. I'm going to end with this slide, which is we hired a professional landscape architect by the name of Stephen Christie. I knew Stephen from previous work at another land trust I worked at near Chicago. He had already designed 2, maybe 3 conservation burial grounds. 2 of them had been built, and I knew through working with Stephen his ability to think about taking what our vision was of a natural burial operations cemetery and putting it on the landscape. And you will see in a minute, or maybe you saw on the opening slide, something that looks very much like this. His design work literally went on the ground, looks very similar to this. And yeah, and we couldn't be more pleased with doing that. Next slide.
Steve, it's
I'm gonna now turn, yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to Andra. She's gonna take you through the operations. So we brought the business up to the point of forming it. We created a board. We selected the first board. Importantly, one of our former board presidents, Francis Verbois, was handpicked to be the president of the board of this organization, Casper Creek, because of her sales background, her entrepreneurial sort of vibe, and her deep love for conservation and people. And then, I don't know, we really lucked out in getting this young lady, Andra, who will take it away here in a minute. Where do you go find a cemetery manager? You put ads out and you hope you find someone as talented and as special as Andra has been. And I think we knew early on that Andra was the right choice. And you'll see why in a minute, if you don't already know Andra. But she took this whole idea that was on paper and made it happen operationally and in reality and with people. Again, going after that soft element we wanted, which was to deepen relationships between people and land. So Andra is going to take it from here, and then we'll both come back at the end and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was incredibly kind. And all of this has been building up, all of those folders, all of the working with neighbors and local government and defining a space. I think one of the things that was very important, that's important to note, particularly from the land trust background, is that they were using the resources that they had available to them, which in this case was land. And in choosing a place for the Casper Creek Natural Cemetery, it was incredibly important that it was both ecologically sound and ethically sound. And a lot of those decisions went into the 16.094 acres that we operate within, not that anyone's counting. And it became this full-fledged business by the time that I was hired. So some of the first things I had to do when I came on board were to look at the state requirements and regulations. These are different in every single state. For our business, it was the best fit to be an Illinois not-for-profit business, which does not make us a 501c3. We are a separate business from the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation. However, when every family completes a contract with us, about 50% is a donation directly to them. And that's what's able to fuel and fund that stewardship that takes place, in addition to being able to preserve the land that we care for and to provide the burial services that those seeking conservation burial need. The first thing that I did when I came on board was work with our licensing. So we are licensed both as a cemetery operator through the state of Illinois and as a pre-need organization. At this time, it was late 2020, and all of this goes to the state comptroller. I learned the names of every dog of everyone who worked in the state comptroller's office because we were all working from home at the time. And it was a long and complicated process. Even looking at the idea of pre-need and at-need was something pretty important to the organization that they'd already started the process of before I came on board. For anyone looking at operating a cemetery, knowing that pre-need requires a third-party trust to be involved. We happen to work with ClearPoint Federal, who is based out of Batesville, Indiana, and specializes in this. It means that the money that families are paying to a cemetery is held separately until services are provided. It's a pretty important part of what we do, but maybe not something that everyone anticipates, particularly when you're looking at creating your own burial ground. We also looked really closely into our Green Burial Council certification. And one of the questions was between a natural burial ground or a conservation burial ground. It's most in line with the mission of the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation to go that extra step and be a conservation burial ground. Some of that includes, Steve mentioned, our conservation easements. We have not one, but 2 conservation easements on our 16 acres. And that just is able to ensure the absolute preservation and care for the land in ways that, particularly here in Illinois, haven't always been afforded to burial grounds. And it's something I take very seriously. The photo you see here is also something I didn't anticipate when I was first hired, but I also got my burn certification because we do, as a matter of our preservation for the land, actively burn the prairie grounds. And you can see in the lower corner, this is after we have performed an interment and their memorial stone is there. It's something we work very, very hard to share with the families we care for, is that conservation is part of it. And it means a lot to me to be able to know that no one ever has to have questions about how the treatment of the land is taking place, because they can call me. That's my job. Coming into this and immediately coming into the licensing and the paperwork, which I'm very, very good at, also means, how do we focus this? How do we look at restoration in the biggest part of the word? It's about land, it's about tradition, it's about family. And this has been an organization that is fully behind that. It's also part of our marketing to look at healing as an active act. Not only through seeding the prairie, not only through pulling out garlic mustard, which is what these lovely volunteers are shown doing. It also comes down to, how do you balance business with your values? And that can be difficult, but something to really, really hone in on for all of those interested in this kind of a venture. Where does the pricing model set? What is the value that you're giving your community, and how do you clearly convey that? What's the tone? How do you market it? I come from a business background primarily, and I have also worked in print journalism. And I can't remember ever seeing an ad for a cemetery in my whole life. People often choose those that have served their families before them or their local. And while what conservation offers is a return to a very, very old style of doing things, of caring for our own. And it also offers being able to invest in something that lines up with your values. It's not easy, and it's not something we see a lot of. And so that was also part of, from the ground up, what we had to do. It comes down to sharing the story. We have had a lot of success through print organizations, through in-person presentations, from everything from retired teachers associations to book clubs to faith communities wanting to share this for their members as we age, and these considerations become closer and closer to our forefront. We are also working really hard to connect with funeral directors. These are people who have been serving the community for decades, generations, and I am yet to find someone in that role who isn't happy to work with us, isn't prepared to offer green burial services, even if they don't call it that. We do a lot of that through one-on-one connections. We also do that through attending the Iowa Funeral Directors Convention, the Illinois Funeral Directors Convention, and just really making ourselves visible and letting them know these are options. And those things are really focused around people already providing death care, but to let them know this is a way to empower them as well as our community members. It's something that is growing. Steve mentioned some statistics earlier. There are more through the National Funeral Directors Association that show that more than 60% of folks, when they look at a survey, are interested in greener options. They're interested in more personalized options, and this is part of that. So when we look at this, particularly from the business perspective, it's an invitation for a connection with funeral directors who are already caring for our communities. It's a way for them to expand what they can offer. And again, Illinois is one of only 11 states that requires that a licensed funeral director be involved every step of the way. And we're glad for it, and to be able to build these connections and tap into some of these relationships that have been built over years and years and generations and generations. It's also about who we can welcome to the burial grounds. And these are some photos of some of the largest events we have had, largest celebrations of life. I love to tell this story of the top photo, which was a celebration of life and a burial for someone who was a trombone player in the All-Americana Big Brass Band in our Tri-State area. And the entire Big Brass Band came to play for him, and he wanted it to be a New Orleans style celebration of life. And so this is a photo of people really embodying that. The lower photo is a look at someone who chose a different path, who had passed away many years ago, and their family actually chose to reinter them with us because CCNC didn't exist when this person passed away. Those are all things, when you look at what kinds of relationships we're building, are important. We want people to know that from every single step, we're with them from the moment of burial and interment to the preparation of the site to what is the future option, which here I love to show here on the right. That is one of our gravestones and a site in which one of our very, very first full body burials took place. And you can see the difference and the growth from the prairie flowers that we hand seed after every interment and how it's contributing to our overall growth. And that's just a different kind of relationship with end of life care than many of us grew up having. This remains true throughout all of the disposition services that we embrace. The photo here on the right is of a family who chose an ash interment in keeping with their beliefs, and on the left, an ash scattering in our memorial grove. This all still comes into play with how we interact with the land and how we interact with the very, very serious care that we provide every day. Here on the left, you can see a family who has pre-planned for ash scattering in our memorial grove, bringing their children and their grandchildren to see some of our conservation efforts. And on the right, you can see one of our prescribed fires for the land, which is returning good fire, which is returning practices that help for the health and care of the land through individual efforts. And every family I work with is aware of this and is so glad to know that growth can come from what seems like a closing. And my highest honor is still to present that as a step forward. It's not closed. It continues to grow. This is time where, Steve, do you want to share a little bit more about our tribal nation partners or some of the land reconstruction that we do?
Sure. Thanks, Andra. So Casper Bluff is about 130-acre preserve, and it is 16 of that 130, maybe it's 150 now. We've added some in the last few years. 16 is the Casper Creek Natural Cemetery. We preserved the land originally for two reasons. One, because of its natural heritage. We knew it was prairie and oak savanna. Historically, still had some of the structure of the oak savanna. The prairie had been tilled and turned into ultimately a grazing and hay area, but was ripe for prairie restoration. So that's the natural side. The cultural side is because we're on the Mississippi River, there are literally hundreds, maybe thousands of tribal burial mounds along the bluffs of the Mississippi River, including Casper Bluff. And we've connected with two of the descendant communities of the people who built those burial mounds, the Ho-Chunk Nation, formerly known as the Winnebago Nation, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Oklahoma. Both tribes were forcibly removed in the mid-1800s. Both love to be back on this land visiting their ancestors, and we welcome that. We've been working with them for about a dozen years. And I think Andra has a picture Are you showing that picture, Andra? I'm not quite seeing it, but anyways, just last week we worked with two tribal elders, Bill Quackenbush and Clayton Winishik, actually three, and Cloris Lowe, to do a prescribed burn on the one of the mounds. Yeah, that's the image there. So that's a Thunderbird effigy. That's a large effigy, large mound built in the shape of a raptor, bird of prey. 216-foot long wingspan, goes out to that beautiful white oak you see in the distance, and the tail is kind of right in the foreground. Still very present on the landscape. And this is the first time that these indigenous men were able to burn or help lay fire on this landscape in over 200 years. It was a very meaningful experience. And so this gets back to how strongly we are tied to where we lay our ancestors, our loved ones to rest. Think about people coming back to Casper Creek Natural Cemetery who are descendants of the people buried there now, 800 or 1,000 years later. I don't know of any other thing that we could do that deepens our connection to the land than burying our loved ones in the land and then keeping it natural and beautiful and healthy. So thanks for letting me share that, Andra.
Steve, if you feel up to sharing some of your own personal experiences with that kind of tradition,
Sure.
I want you to feel welcome to it, although not required.
Yeah, no, happy to. So Susan, my wife Susan, and I obviously because of our values and interest in the land and conservation, we're drawn to this kind of final resting place through natural processes in a conservation burial area. And we had a son who was born, lived 18 years, wonderful human being, was like an old soul in a broken body, had lots of disabilities, Aaron Barg. And he died in 2009, and we decided to cremate him because we weren't sure where we wanted his final resting place to be. So for years, on his birthday, September 13th, we would sprinkle a few ashes in and plant a tree in any number of our favorite natural areas and preserves. Obviously, we did this with permission of the landowners, including 2 trees when we moved out to Joe Daviess County in 2013, right next to the kiosk, the welcome kiosk at Casper Bluff, not knowing that in the future we might develop a natural burial ground there. So in 2021, we gathered some friends and family and spread Aaron's ashes in the memorial grove, the remaining ashes he had. And it was wonderful, very meaningful, and has connected Susan and our daughter Hannah and everyone who attended that celebration of life to that place, again, in really meaningful ways. So it's been really interesting for me to be a part of the development of this natural burial ground, to work with indigenous tribal communities who have descendants in this relatively same area, who were buried naturally hundreds and hundreds of years ago, still coming back to this place, honoring their ancestors, and to think that we might carry on a family tradition in that same way at the same property. So it's one of those wonderful full circle moments for us, and very personal. And also the other side of me is very business-like. It's really helps us steward our land. So I kind of vacillate between both those worlds, but for this case, very personal. Thanks, Andra. Cheers to Aaron.
Steve. Cheers to Aaron. And that's part of what we do. It's very heartfelt, and it's interesting when we look at this kind of conversation about how to embark on it. It takes all of those parts. And so the last few slides and us sharing has been about this human element, this social responsibility that I feel like we all share and are so proud of. But it does also exhibit its success in different ways, including this. In 2023, we contributed over $60,000 to the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation purely through the contributions that came through contracts. This doesn't include new memberships, gifts in honor of loved ones. Oftentimes people will ask, in lieu of flowers, please make a donation to this organization, and other means of support. In total, since we started in 2021, we've reached almost $150,000 in contributions through this particular cycle. It's about so much more, but because you've all been on the journey with us of how to support a stewardship team and in trying to protect a beautiful place, these things do matter. I want to take you back to one of those slides that Steve showed. One Christie, one chainsaw, one goal to make things better. You ready to take it away, Steve?
Yeah, so I love this slide. So the next one kind of shows where we went from there. And the next slide shows where we went. I don't know, did we have a slide of the, I don't think we actually had a slide of our new stewardship shop, but some of these funds helped us build an actual stewardship shop that has heat and running water, and a place where people can actually work year round. This was our previous stewardship shop in an unheated garage that housed all of our people and our equipment. So yeah, it's all happy. It's all been great, except for all the questions you're going to ask here in a minute. So I'm anxious to get to answering your questions and some of the challenges that we met. It's not been all rosy. We don't want to paint it that way. There's been some very difficult challenges along the way, and we're looking forward to sharing a little bit about that. But I think we want to save some space for questions. Is that right, Andra? Are we ready to go there? And Jody?
I think so. And I know I want to respect everyone's time. I know that we all care so much about conservation burial and sharing this kind of case story that we've run it a little tight. But if Jody is open to having a Q&A session, I think Steve and I are here for it and really looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I'm going to work with my technology to get to the questions. Thank you, Steve. The other business was a zip line, but then somebody else got there first. So such as it is. Thank you, Andra and Steve, so much for the numbers and the logisticating and also the soft heart of what this work is. And that quote there is beautiful. I'm going to go into the chat here a little bit where folks are coming from. There are folks from Ottawa. There are folks from California and Washington and New Hampshire and Australia. And the first question was, how did you get your first 161 acres?
Yeah, and I tried to answer that in the chat.
Mhm.
2 of the properties were donated. It was a 56-acre property from the Schermeyer family. It's currently called Schermeyer Teaching Forest. And the other was a 19-acre, 20-acre preserve called Bueller, named after the former mayor of Galena. And then our first acquisitions were really in the early 2000s. We're at Wapello Land and Water Reserve, Casper Bluff Land and Water Reserve. Both of these properties have indigenous and natural heritage on them. And again, per the response I put in the chat, Illinois has had, up until this past year, 2 private foundations that gave money to land trusts in Illinois to purchase land. That's the Grand Victoria Foundation and the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation. And that's where I would say 90% of our funding came for land acquisitions. So that's where predominantly all the rest of the money came to acquire those other 2,000 acres, with the exception of a large donation that came recently of land further to the east of the county. So I hope that answers that question.
I also wanna chime in on this answer, incorporating another question that's in the chat that asked about what was the largest expense in looking into this. And while some of this kind of legacy action was before I came on board, some of the things I think Steve can speak to, but that I can say is that in-kind legal representation, really intensive looks at how to handle contract negotiations, how to negotiate in between. I mentioned earlier, we have not 1, but 2 conservation easements covering our 16.094 acres. 2 might be excessive, but looking into just how 1 interacts with the land that you have available is very important. Being able to protect your organization and those that you hope to serve is incredibly important. And without the work of our late legal advisor, Tom Cunningham, who passed away last year, I don't know that we would be as successful as we are. And it is an important thing to know that that investment is incredibly important. Right, Steve?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so, one of the challenges is we borrowed 300,000. We still, 4 years later owe 200 and I'm going to say 280,000 of that. So paying down that debt to essentially cover the costs of starting this business. Again, a big part of that was the development of the cemetery itself, the design, the creation of a parking lot, creation of the monoliths you see on this slide in the distance, planting some native shrubs, creating a gathering area, a stone gathering area, much like a Jens Jensen council ring. All of that we're still challenged with how do we pay down that debt? The income coming from the cemetery or to the cemetery is not enough. In fact, they're just now this year starting to break even with covering their own operating expenses. But that trajectory is exactly where we had hoped it would be. It took about the exact same time we thought it would take, maybe even a little faster. So the big thing is how do we pay down that line of credit that we borrowed from the bank to construct the cemetery. We'll get there. I'm
Yeah,
confident, but it's a
We
challenge.
hear ya. It's a big upfront. This whole thing is a big upfront,
Yeah,
and there's all of the beautiful, meaningful things along the way, but it's that there's risk and investment involved. And the next question from Susan Greer, which was talking about neighbors and NIMBY, not in my backyard.
Hmm?
Did you guys have any of that in your risk assessment?
I can let Steve tell this story because it was before I came on board. What I can tell you now is that I work really closely. As you can see from the photo that's on the screen, we're in a rural area. We're surrounded by farmland and we're surrounded by farmers. And it is one of my greatest accomplishments, I feel, to be able to come into this project and meet them one-on-one and help alleviate their fears in the day-to-day. They all know me. They're all willing to loan me a truck or an ATV if I need it. But that wasn't always so. And that I'll turn this over to Steve to kindly explain some of that, how that worked to begin with, because it is a NIMBY situation, but mostly through a lack of education or a lack of understanding of what it was we were trying to do.
yeah. So to actually run a cemetery, we had to get a special use permit through our county. And so we had to go through the whole permit form, which was lengthy. We had to have a natural resource assessment, which included soil testing and all sorts of other things. So importantly, and I like this, any entity that is applying for a special use permit, neighbors to that entity, in this case, the Casper Creek Natural Cemetery, are sent I don't know if it's registered mail or the other form, but it's mail that they know gets to the it comes from the county and goes to the landowners surrounding. So we had heard from we had gotten calls from, I don't know, 3 or 4 of the 6 landowners. So there were, let's say, 3 landowners that had not responded. A public hearing was coming up where our special use permit was going to allow for public comment, kind of like a hearing. And so I wanted to meet those neighbors before we just met them in this public hearing. Not a good time to, meet your neighbors. And I'd already known a few of them, and some of them sent letters of support to the county zoning board supporting this activity. But one neighbor in particular was hostile. I literally drove up to their farmhouse, knocked on the door. They came out. I had a map and some information I was showing them, spread out on my vehicle. He was visibly upset by what I was sharing with him, went in to get his brother. His brother came out, but his brother had called his sister who lives up the street, works for the county. 3 people came quickly to the car, all puffed up, and hot. I thought I was going to get punched out. And I just said, look, bottom line, I want you to come to the public hearing and I want you to share your concerns with the body who's making this decision. And that's it. We don't want to disturb anybody. We don't want to hurt anyone's farming business. So I'll just end with this. I learned about a month later that their hostilities ran about 40 years deep and were really not directed to us, but to the people we bought the property from, the Caspers, who had purchased it from this neighbor's uncle. And the uncle had promised, according to these people, to sell the property to them, not the Caspers. So really what I was dealing with was 40 years of pent-up emotion that was coming out because we were putting a cemetery in here. And one of the things they said was that the cemetery was going to disturb their cattle operation. And almost all the guys on the zoning board laughed at them because they were cattle ranchers too. They raised cattle too. But it was irrational, and it was 40 years old, emotion. So
So
we're
I
fine.
would love
We're
to
fine
speak
with the
to
name.
this too. Yeah. I
All
would
right.
love to speak to this too. And I think that Steve sharing this story, particularly for those of you who are interested in being able to look at these opportunities in your area, should know that these kinds of stories might come up. But when I first
Yeah.
came on board, one of the things Steve first said was, I don't know if you can go talk to those people. And I was like, oh, I'm from rural New Mexico. I'm sure it's going to go fine. But there's also this experience of what we're doing. They weren't upset because it was a burial ground. And sometimes when you are burying people, people aren't upset because of the burial, right? It trickles down in this way. And knowing that and coming with a soft heart and a good eye for providing what people need is what's important. It never gets easier, but it gets better. And I think that's a really important part. Steve and I worked on this workshop, being able to present this, and we wanted to give the business perspective for it, particularly for land trusts. There is this other component, and sometimes it's that, the soft side. It's sometimes acknowledging that it's 40 years of trauma all wrapped up in one comment, and that's okay.
Andra, I fully confirm that in grief of all kinds, there is a lot wrapped up in a lot of years sometimes, and holding space both on land and with each other is part of what this work is. And it's tricksy sometimes to sort that out. Like, where is this coming from? What is happening here? But we have 100 years of death taboos and 100 years of grudges in some ways that we're all working through. So there's that.
There's that.
I'm gonna move. Oh, sorry.
Well, I really want to thank everyone who is still, all 49 folks who are still on the call. And I want to respect everyone's time. We're just about at 7:15. If it's okay with you, Jody, if there's anyone who has a more organic question that they want to ask, either through unmuting or through the chat.
Yeah, bring it. I can scroll down further. This question has to do with the percentages of a burial site that is a donation to the land in a perpetual care fund. And I think, Meg, I think we can totally talk about that in a startup connection meeting. Maybe there's some question about membership. We know the zip line was number 2.
Okay. I'm taking a look too, and I want to say particularly to Katie, I would love to be able to share more with you about our relationships with our Indigenous tribal partners and how that they help lead a lot of our decisions. I know that this is something that Steve would like to have a hand in, and I don't know that it's something we can address tonight, except to tell you that this has been a 12-year building upon trying to heal these relationships. And you can contact us through caspercreekinc@gmail.com, and maybe we can further that conversation separately, just for time's sake. The Borough Land Trust asked how many burials have we done and how many contracts do we have? That's a good question. So we've performed over 30 interments and burials and have a little over 120 contracts. About 75% of the people who complete contracts with us are doing it pre-need, planning for themselves in advance. Sorry, I'm going very fast through these questions. Those are the primary ones I think we can get through here.
I think there's a question
Jody, I think
about the cemetery being its own legal entity with a leasing agreement. So I think that might, if you have like another 3 minutes in you to describe what that relationship is, that might be really helpful.
Absolutely. So the way it shakes down is that CCNC is an independent business. It is a for-profit business, although we have a licensing through the state as an Illinois not-for-profit, completely separate from the 501c3 that is the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation. The Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation owns the land upon which we operate. And because of that, that's one of the things I got to just tertially earlier. There are 2 conservation easements that are protecting our land. And so one of them is with the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation. And the second is actually with a partner of ours from Rockford, Illinois, that is the Natural Land Institute. And so they hold the second conservation easement, and so this land is protected in all of perpetuity, and our relationship is that we operate upon the grounds. About 50% of what a family pays when they complete a contract with CCNC goes as a direct donation to the 501c3, and the rest is for cemetery services. That covers opening and closing of the grave, the perpetual care. I think earlier in the chat, someone had been asking about perpetual care and upkeep and things like that. That's all enveloped in the flat fee that we offer to a family at the time of contract completion. No later charges, and all of that is set in the percentages asked for from our states. I see another question here from the Borough Land Trust. The burial capacity for our 16 acres. It's an excellent question. So one of the things that we went through for being certified as a conservation burial ground through the Green Burial Council is deeply related to burial capacity. And each of our grave sites is 5 foot by 10 foot, which is much larger than you find in a conventional lawn cemetery. we're also contingent to that Casper Bluff Land and Water Reserve land that Steve mentioned earlier. And so our usage space is smaller than that 16.094 acres I keep mentioning, but also that we are contiguous to that land that is protected and preserved. It falls within the ratio that is defined for a conservation burial ground, which I don't know off the top of my head, but you can find on that handy little table that's on the Green Burial Council website.
I think
One
it's
of the things-
300 per acre, but that's off the top of my head.
Right, it's 300 to 400. Thank you,
Mhm.
Jody.
But you can if you have area that you don't bury in, you can be more dense in other area. So it's a more complicated math than that.
It is. It's pretty complicated math, as Jody said. So we do take a more conventional approach to our burial layout than many conservation burial grounds do. Many take a more organic approach, which I think is beautiful and I support. I personally think in spreadsheets, and we take kind of a spreadsheet approach. But the land we conserve and the land that is allocated and surrounding, and the specific burial spaces mathematically come out to being in keeping with and exceeding that kind of density ratio. Thank you for that very astute question.
You guys, thank you so much for this. Are there any other last minute questions or thoughts for the order? I love that we've been sitting with this slide. A green burial is soft on the atmosphere, soft on the soil, and soft on the heart. Thank you to Noah Dries and to all of us who are doing this work. Soft on the heart, soft on the soil. info@conservationburialalliance.org is a good way to reach me. You can reach Andra at Casper Creek, and really grateful to both you, Andra, and Steve for sharing both the financials and the business and the heart of what this offering is, and the courage, because we've mentioned 2020 a couple of times in all this, but it's kind of been in the background. So I just want to say that starting a conservation burial ground during a pandemic is not a small thing. Also, need to honor that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for hosting us. Please do reach out. I'm always available at the posted contacts on our website, email, cell phone. I am so grateful to be part of this community.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jody.
I am so buoyed by all of you humans who are showing up in this community and growing this thing, and it is not easy, and it is risky, and it is beautiful, and it's worthy. So I will share this link out once I have downloaded and done the techno things, and in the meantime, I wish you all a beautiful evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, take good care, all.